Hey everybody, today I'm here with Mark Stahlman, who is the founder and director of the Center for Digital Life and has had a very long and storied career in tech and business. Mark, do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure, Daniel. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's actually the Center for the Study of Digital Life. That is easy to miss since the URL is digitallife, all one word, .center. The center is an effort that I started in 2015. So it's now approaching its 8th anniversary. It began as a result of work that I had been doing with some friends for the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. Net assessment is a very unusual procedure in that it does not involve strategy. It does not involve policy. It involves a diagnosis of the situation that must precede successfully doing strategy and deployments and so forth. So the man behind this is named Andy Marshall. He is a giant in that world, very well known, but probably not so well known outside of net assessment. The other primary influence, I would say, for CSDL was Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan, I'm an old man now. I turned 75 a couple of days ago. And so I was there in the 60s when McLuhan was publishing. And I used McLuhan's work in my own career on Wall Street. I was a technology strategist. I brought America Online public. I was the first analyst to support Sun Microsystems. Those were both career-threatening activities, but they panned out. And so now we have a couple of projects at CSDL, which I hope we will talk about. One of them is Trivium University. URL there is trivium.university. And the other is not yet launched, but will soon be launched as a Substack under the name Digital Net Assessment, Three Spheres Newsletter. So that's me, up to date.
There's also a consulting wing of it, it looked like.
Yes, there's a for-profit consulting company that brings net assessment into various projects called Exogenous Inc. And so the URL there is exogenousinc, all one word, .com, or we just simply call it EXO. There's also another project, which I should mention just for completeness purposes. The name of this project is Dialogos, and the Dialogos project is aimed at organized religion and trying to bring to the attention of these organizations the paradigm shift which we are now experiencing. That paradigm shift is something that a lot of people are resisting understanding. They would prefer to apply their various frameworks, some of them dating back 50 years, 20 years, 30 years, integralism, complexity science. There's a long list of these things, and they have all failed because they were invented to apply to a paradigm which is now obsolete. So we need a new approach.
Yeah, I guess the journal, is that the name of the journal also?
Dianoeticon is the name of the center's journal. We published one issue. That issue was published actually in 21. It's dated 20, but whatever. Yeah. And that's a very important exploration of faculty psychology, which now needs to replace what has taken over as cognitive psychology. That is an approach which is utterly failed.
What is faculty psychology?
Faculty psychology has shown up in a variety of ways more modern, but it's a pre-modern approach. And in fact, Aristotle, in his key text, most people would know it, if they do at all, by the Latin title, De Anima. In English, it would be On the Soul. So it turns out that psychology, of course, is the study of the psyche. Psyche is a Greek word which corresponds to the English word soul. So psychology should be a study of the soul and the faculties of the soul. And so faculty psychology is a critical piece of how we're going to get a grip, not necessarily a way out, but at least a much better understanding of the situation that we're now in.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think you sent me your piece from that journal on a Facebook comment, and I read your piece and found it really interesting. That piece, I think you were talking about sort of like kind of psychological engineering, social engineering a little bit.
Right.
And then there was a lot about kind of Aristotle from different authors, which I don't know that much about, but it looked really,
We're all going to have to learn our Aristotle. Whitehead famously said, of course, Western philosophy is all a footnote to Plato. Well, it turns out that Aristotle is far more significant for what we're doing today. And therefore, this is quite difficult, actually. If you went out to try to study Aristotle today, where would you go?
Yeah.
Nobody knows.
One thing that I try to do in my work a lot is sometimes I recognize that people are talking about very similar things, but maybe they're using different
Sure.
kind of terminologies, which
Yeah.
actually make it hard for people to understand each other. Like for me, like Rudolf Steiner and Carl Jung, for instance, we're actually talking about a lot of the very same things as was like Jean Gebser. But if you don't take the time to figure out how those terminologies,
right.
So
but the commonality between all of those you just mentioned, and we could add to the list, we could put Ken Wilber in there and so forth. These people are all dealing with a very different paradigm than the one we live in today. Not a single one of them had a word to say about artificial intelligence. Not a single one of them had anything to say about robots. They had not a single thing to say about the digital paradigm in which we now live. So while all of their work is quite interesting, particularly as a reflection on the previous electric paradigm, unfortunately, they have very little to say about the world in which we now live.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know if I would totally agree with that, but it's a longer discussion.
No, I'm sure you don't.
But let's go through kind of so I was just going to say that one of the things that really intrigued me when I started getting into your work a little bit was this interest in the soul, which is something I've been writing a lot about. And in fact, I years ago I published a really amazing book by this guy Patrick Harper called The Secret Tradition of the Soul, who talks about the soul in Western Hermeticism, and yeah, just kind of like this common understanding of it in a way. So what I'm curious, sort of like what do you understand about the soul? Like what is it meaning? What's its meaning for you?
Well, famously, Descartes wound up separating the soul from the body. So we've been living in this material immaterial dualism since the print paradigm. It was the technology of print that drove the Jesuits, who taught Descartes. And so that separation of the soul and the body now needs to be fundamentally set aside. That's all way behind us now. And so the most simple answer is, again, from Aristotle. Aristotle's overall view was a monistic view. That's to say, an integral view. And that integration is typically called hylomorphism, where hylo or hyli, the vowels often change when you're transliterating from Greek. Hylomorphism, hyli is wood, material, and morphism is form. And so Aristotle, not Plato's, but Aristotle's entire understanding is based upon the integral and necessary relationship between matter and form. The soul is the form of a living creature. Everything that's alive has a soul. Aristotle, in the book in English on the soul, and here I would recommend the Joe Sachs translation, which is an excellent English translation. There are lots of translations, as you can imagine, of this, but many of them fall down at critical points. But Joe Sachs has gotten it right. It turns out that there are differences between living creatures, differences between their souls, but it is a form. It is immaterial. It is not something that is made up of atoms and whatever else you might think about particle physics. That does not describe the soul, cannot describe the soul, because it's immaterial. It is a form. And understanding forms, and maybe most importantly, how forms change us, called formal causality. So Aristotle is also the person who most carefully picked apart the topic of causality. As you probably know, causality has largely been discarded in scientific work, replaced with statistics, particularly for human beings. You can't experiment on them, so you have to collect statistical correlations, but correlation, of course, is not causality. So understanding the causality of human affairs, which ultimately is necessary for us to get a grip on the situation that we're now in, that cannot be done statistically. That cannot be done mathematically. That needs to be done formally. And so the break between Plato and Aristotle on the topic of forms, Plato, as you recall, had forms in an ideal world. And in fact, there's a lot in Plato which you can understand, since his mentor Socrates was murdered by democracy. You can well imagine that he was a little pissed off about all of that. And so he took all the forms and elevated them, moved them out of everyday Athenian life. Aristotle brought them back and incorporated matter and form as the necessary structure of reality. If we can get back to a much more robust understanding of forms, and I've had, as you can imagine, many, maybe hundreds of conversations with modern, very intelligent, very motivated modern thinkers. And it turns out that their understanding of forms is largely missing. We just haven't been taught this. And so getting back to an integral relationship between matter and form brings us to the form of living creatures, their souls. That then allows us to understand the human soul. And there's a very rich history in doing this, of course. So we have lots and lots of resources to call upon once we realize that the modern approach, including those authors that you just cited, all of that is quite modern. That is still important to understand and study, but we have, in a fundamental sense, moved on as a result of digital technology.
And what you're talking about a little bit reminds me of Rupert Sheldrake and his whole morphic resonance, morphogenic fields kind of exploration. Is that along the same kind of lines for you?
I have not read enough Sheldrake. I'm familiar with some of the controversies around him and so forth to give you a solid answer.
Yeah.
My guess is talking about fields is an attempt to bring this into the context of modern physics. Modern physics has failed. Doesn't mean that he's saying the same thing, but he's attempting to talk to people who believe they understand the 20th century electric shift to fields, magnetic fields, electrodynamic fields, and so forth. That whole physics, ultimately bringing us to quantum mechanics, was appropriate. I'm not arguing with it. It was quite appropriate for the time in which it had arisen. But unfortunately, it's not going to work very well for us going forward. So I'll read some more Sheldrake and have a better answer.
I'd love to know. But I'm curious, when you say modern physics has failed, it's hard to understand in what sense you mean that, because many people would say that, you know, physics is actually become incredibly powerful and robust. And we have now quantum computing, plus we have the discovery that the universe is not locally real, which just won the Nobel Prize in 2022. So I'm not sure what it is about it that.
Right. Well, the answer to that question in terms of paradigm shifts is always a matter of the practitioners in the field. And it turns out the practitioners in the field of physics have, in a significant measure, thrown their hands up and said this just isn't working. So string theory has lost an enormous amount of attention by the smart people who were involved with it. You go through any of the other categories that have attracted most of the research effort. Nobel, of course, is always very much a lagging indicator. So Nobel is going to talk about things that were interesting once upon a time. But the physicists themselves, much like the psychologists, much like the sociologists, much like the cosmologists, are throwing their hands up and going, this doesn't work anymore.
I'm still not quantum physics is obviously working as a predictive. It's the most powerful predictive tool.
No, it's an engineering effort. There's nothing. There really is. There's almost no physics involved in what you're calling quantum computing. Mm-hmm. The relation between science and engineering is not very well understood. The truth of the matter is, of course, that engineering precedes science. Science winds up becoming a rationalization of successful engineering. Mm-hmm. And so to date, we do not have any quantum computers. Mm-hmm. What they will be used for, apart from the usual encryption story and so forth, which drives so much of this, if you got something that can potentially advance encryption, of course, you'll be funded. And so we're back to the military as the driver in many of these fields, which have become obsolete. So the military has pumped an enormous amount of money into complexity science. They've pumped an enormous amount of money into quantum. They pumped an enormous amount of money in other areas. Santa Fe Institute to this day is supported by $10 million a year from the Department of Energy, people who make and own the bombs. Mm. And so there's a number of topics, quantum being one of them, where you can get funding, but that doesn't mean that it works. That doesn't mean that it's even really being applied. I've had conversations with a number of people who are building quantum computers, and they will very quickly tell you that what happened in the 20s and 30s with quantum mechanics has almost nothing to do with what they're doing today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I mean, that's a whole tangent, but I guess I understand that McLuhan, and also, by the way, I was very interested to hear that you have a personal historical relationship with Norbert Weiner and cybernetics.
Yeah. My father, William Stahlman, who was, he died in 75, but particularly in the 50s and 60s, he was a well-known historian of science, and he was a very close protege of Norbert Weiner. Norbert Weiner was described to me when I was growing up as my godfather.
And there's aspects of your project which are sort of related to that project, like you feel in some ways like continuity.
Yes, and in particular, let me drill down on this topic of the military involvement in all of these efforts. As it turns out, Norbert Weiner, for those who don't know, boy genius, got a PhD at 18 from Harvard, was sent off to go study with Bertrand Russell. It's not clear to me whether he hated Bertrand Russell or he hated what Bertrand Russell was doing, but he got together actually with T.S. Eliot, of all people, for Christmas dinner in 1914 in London and said, I don't want to be a philosopher. I don't want to do this logical positivism. I'm going to become a mathematician. And as the apocryphal story goes, T.S. Eliot said, I don't want to be, he was studying philosophy as well at the time. I don't want to be a philosopher either. I think I'll become a poet. So that divergence wound up in March of 1964, as I recall. Norbert Weiner died climbing the stairs to meet Queen of Sweden to get an award. reminding us that meeting with the Queen of Sweden might be a dangerous thing to do with your life. And that came across the radio. I was actually working with my father, the historian of science, on a sports car engine, a racing engine. That was what he did at night, and came across and hit my father very hard. The only time I think I've ever heard him cry. And he turned to me and he said, "Now it's up to you." I said, "What? What's up to you?" Me. I'm 16 years old. What's up? He said, "It's up to you to carry Norbert Weiner's work forward." And I'm now almost 60 years older than that, and I'm still trying to figure that out. But yes, a part of what we are doing, or what I'm doing, or motivates me in cybernetics. And so this is the reason why digital technology, and so my career was on Wall Street. I was following technology companies. I was a programmer for many years, started software companies. And so I've spent a lot of my life trying to understand the digital world, and have come to the conclusion that this has driven, in much the way that McLuhan described for the printing press and for electricity, this has driven a fundamental shift in our underlying grammar. The rules by which we live have been forever changed. All this excitement about Chat GPT and now Atlas being integrated into search engines and so forth, all this excitement is just an overflowing of a subconscious recognition that we all have that the world has fundamentally changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I just thought it'd be useful, maybe just to, kind of for people who don't know McLuhan's kind of ideas around kind of these different revolutions in media technology and how they sort of change consciousness.
Right.
I know you talked about, or he talked about the obviously writing, which Socrates resisted, for instance, because he felt it would destroy memory. And then there was print.
Well, remember, we really don't have Socrates. We have Plato's Socrates. So what's happening in the Phaedrus dialogue is fascinating. So we have Plato, who's writing everything down, putting in the mouth of his now assassinated, I will emphasize again, assassinated by democracy, mentor, Socrates, who then puts a dialogue, he goes another layer down, where Thoth is the Hermetic deity, if you will, is explaining to Pharaoh that he has invented writing. And Pharaoh's response, of course, as you just said, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't do that. That'll destroy memory." Memory turns out to be the faculty that is most important, not imagination. So I'll just remind you, everybody in your audience probably knows this reference. What was it that made Rachel special in Blade Runner? Why was she so different from all the other replicants? And the answer, of course, as Philip K. Dick tells the story, and what Dick was really trying to accomplish with Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep has largely been missed as well, but it's available in his prose writings. He was worried about the humans, not about the replicants and human behavior. But it turns out that she was implanted with Tyrell's niece, Lilith's memories. And so it was what distinguished her from the other replicants or robots was memory. And this is exactly where we are today. We need to remember at a much higher intensity than we need to imagine. We've been imagining for a very long time now, and it has only gotten us in more trouble.
Very interesting. I like that. That's beautiful, actually. Okay, so let's talk about these transitions from oral to print, written language to print, and then to digital, electronic, and then to digital.
Well, it turns out, of course, and you know a great deal about this, and your writings about Aztecs and others refers to a world, an oral paradigm. And that oral paradigm didn't look at all like ours. In particular, there were not personalities, and it's kind of a Borg-like situation. The reference that I would point people to here is Julian Jaynes.
Mhm.
So Julian Jaynes probably is on one of your bookshelves here.
Right, yeah, the origin of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. Yeah.
Right. It turns out that I was Julian Jaynes' last student.
Oh, cool.
And that happened because I was talking with other people I knew at Princeton and asking about Julian. And I was told that Julian was not well physically, and that if I wanted to have a conversation with Julian, I had to get on a train and go down to Princeton, which I did multiple times. Then they fired him. He went to his ancestral home, Prince Edward Island, and I spent a long weekend with him. And a few months later, he was dead. So he had no other students around him at that point. Julian Jaynes is only one of many who have discussed the transition from oral to scribal. So we actually call the next paradigm scribal, and that refers, of course, to written language. But the key to that is not so much the writing, which predates this a long time. So there's a lot of writing on stone and so forth, but the literacy. So the question is having a literate audience. Socrates was a one-on-one sort of guy, or maybe a few people in the dialogue. And memory, it needs to be established in such a way that it can be shared to a literate audience. So the shift from oral to scribal is really the rise of an audience capable of understanding something that has been written at a distance, ultimately leads to a lot of other phenomena like nation states and all sorts of valorization of national languages. But that transition is pretty well documented. There's a lot of people who've written beyond Julian Jaynes about going from an oral to a scribal world. The transition that followed that was from scribal literacy to print. And here again, there's a significant literature about that transition. Elizabeth Eisenstein's volume, for instance, about the effects of print is very important. Print then transitions in the 19th century. And here we have figures like Nietzsche and so forth, who are at that transition when Nietzsche says God is dead. Since Nietzsche comes from a family of Lutheran pastors and was sent to college to become another Lutheran pastor, what he's actually saying, of course, is the printed Bible is dead. So he's announcing the end of print in that statement. And then he does what needs to be done. He starts trying to retrieve. In his case, he's retrieving pre-Socratics, since his job was philology. Retrieving is what we now need to do, given the transition that we have been in, let's say, since 2000. We've been in a digital paradigm. So there are 5 primary underlying communications paradigms: oral, scribal, print, electric. Those 4, Marshall McLuhan talked about all of them throughout his work. The transition we're now going through, Marshall McLuhan died in 1980 and didn't really understand or cared that much about it. The transition we're now going through to digital has, I guess, been our extension of McLuhan. The reason why these things are important is because the underlying structure or grammar of our communications and enormous impact on shaping our behaviors and attitudes. So that's the language that McLuhan used. It's not deterministic, and it's largely subconscious. So what seems to happen, and I'm sure you have stories of your own childhood, and as do I and everybody else, the way that our species operates is that it has to come to grips with the structure of the world around us in the years before puberty. Puberty prepares us, of course, for reproduction. So the critical time period in sort of setting our ground rules comes in what Jean Piaget called the concrete operational stage of development. And that corresponds roughly to what we used to call grammar school. So we learn the grammar of the world around us based on the technologies which are dominant.
You're not using grammar in the terms of like sentence structure. You're using it more in a
Well, actually, that's a very important question. Thank you. It turns out that sentence structure is a very perverse way of understanding grammar.
Yeah.
It is the diagramming of sentences and so forth, which has a number of interesting expansions. And here I'll just bring up Noam Chomsky. So you might wonder, or maybe not, where did Noam Chomsky come from? We know him, of course, as a political anarchist commentator, probably the most widely cited in that political domain. But that's not why we know him. We know him because the Defense Department decided they were going to try to back a project to come up with a universal grammar. And so you will find throughout all of this, and this goes back to the paper, The Inner Senses and Human Engineering, that I think prompted this conversation. It turns out that the military has been trying to figure out how to, I guess, manage or manipulate humans and have largely come to the decision. And some people seem to have, I'm just actually now reading the most recent book by Bruno Latour about metamorphosis. He pins it around 1980 when the military decided that they were not going to be able to mold human beings into what they wanted and instead would need to replace them. So what we now have with AI and its public expressions, which are only obviously a small tip of a very large iceberg, we have a very significant military-led effort to effectively eliminate the human race. The way that this is described in Bruno Latour's work is that the decision was actually reached that planet Earth cannot possibly keep on growing. That we don't have the resources, we don't have the space for it, and so therefore we're going to have to reduce the population. And this comes up in a wide variety of fashions of the way, and I think you're absolutely right as you led off the discussion. People are often talking about the same thing, but using different words. And they do that obviously for a number of reasons. Most importantly, the audience that they're talking to. They don't want to lose the audience. They don't want to piss off the audience. They want to somehow speak in a language that their audience understands. As McLuhan would put it, the audience is the formal cause of any work of art. And so people have different audiences, so they talk about it differently. But the truth of the matter is here, we believe, and this interview is not entirely just of me. I have a quite significant team. You'll see it at the website in terms of fellows and these other projects that we're involved with. We believe that this is probably the largest danger that humanity now faces, which is to say a very well-funded, very committed group of largely military elites who have come to the conclusion that humanity needs to be effectively set aside, except for a handful of people who are those elites. This turns out to have been a deep concern of Norbert Weiner. So just to wrap this back to the Norbert Weiner question, there was, maybe still is, a group of kind of, I guess, left-wing scientists, computer scientists for social responsibility. They have for years awarded a Norbert Weiner Prize, if they're still in operation, but for many years. And that was an anti-war. And so it turns out, coming full circle here, I was a kid, college student in the 60s, going to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. For those who sort of remember their anti-war history, one of the more celebrated events was a sit-in at a Dow Chemical recruiting station. It all seems so very long ago and so mundane, but I was there in the hallway when all that happened, and so I'm finding my anti-war sensibility as I study this question of digital technology and humanity. I'm finding the anti-war component of it coming much more to the fore. Ironically, perhaps, as I announced in the beginning, introducing myself, the origins of the center are in a think tank at the Pentagon.
I just want to because it's so common now for the sense of there being this sort of conspiratorial sense of these kind of mysterious overlords who are kind of engineering society to bring about nefarious purposes, but it's all often left very kind of vague and abstract. I mean, for instance, well, I wouldn't even say vague. Like Russell Brand has actually been doing extremely excellent kind of reporting and whatever you want to call it, punditing on the World Economic Forum, and their interest in automation, wanting to also sort of create robot armies, robot workers, to develop technologies that measure people's brain waves so that even their thoughts are under the control or surveillance of the elite. I mean, who is the agency that's ultimately behind all of this? I mean, is it people who do not know what they do, or are there people with actual evil intent?
No, I think the key here is that none of this is hiding. Mm-hmm. And for those who get attracted to something like Bilderberg, which has now been replaced by Davos, I can tell you with a high degree of certainty that's not where it happens. If it's behind closed doors, if it's a secret project, if it's a bunch of people who nobody knows, I will guarantee you they're not the ones. It's very easy to figure this out. Who is advocating that we leave planet Earth and become a multi-planetary or multi-galactic civilization? Elon Musk. That's not human beings.
Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But that human beings are not going to live on Mars. No. We need food. We need oxygen.
Oh, I know. It's impossible.
It's impossible. So therefore, it has to be some sort of an android. Yeah. And Musk has announced, of course, his most important invention is Optimus. Yeah. And he's doing the Neuralink. So I don't know Elon Musk personally. I follow many of the stories about him, but he's the most obvious example here of somebody who is not trying to promote the further development and, if you will, the well-being of the human race. Yeah. But the origin of so much of this winds up being the battlefield. Yeah. So those of us who have not fought war, those of us who have not been trained to do this, might not so easily recognize that that's totally, from the standpoint of the world's militaries, it's totally ridiculous. Why would you allow a human being to go into battle? And none of this is secret. All this is very public information. And so I know Russell, sort of, and he's got an audience. And so Russell is not really exploring what's going on here. He is supporting himself through an audience that wants this to be sensationalized. It's not sensational. Eric Schmidt is the AI czar for the U.S. military. No secrets. Everybody knows this. get the structure of all the committees and all the things, and he got or that group of people got tens of billions of dollars to spend in the infrastructure bill. So it is largely the fact that people do not want to. So let me just riff on conspiracies for a moment here.
I mean, I guess from their inner world, from their subjective experience, they still somehow believe they're doing something humanitarian, or is it completely?
Oh, of course, yeah. No, when addressing the question of poverty, when addressing the question of oppression, it's very easy to convince yourself this is happening because we have too many people. Easy. And very easy to convince yourself what we will wind up with. Yes, it'll be fewer people, but they will be much better people. So this is kind of the modern version of eugenics, which, as you recall, was a liberal progressive project. It was not a conservative project. It was a very much the progressive movement in the early 20th century were uniformly eugenicists.
Well, that's also become this weird switch in a way, because it now feels as if kind of technocracy, kind of technocratic authoritarianism, is now seems like a progressive project, whereas elements on the right seem to be more the ones who are fighting for some type of freedom, some type of preservation of civil liberties.
Right. But I'm friends with Nadine Strossen, if you know Nadine.
Yeah,
Nadine was until it went through the transition, the weird flip you're talking about. She was the head of the ACLU. She has been invited to speak to Congress by Republicans, not Democrats. She has been deeply involved in a number of organizations, some of which I'm very familiar with. So she is a very classical 60s, 70s progressive left liberal who cannot get any attention in that crowd at all. Quite remarkable.
Okay, but I feel like we this was terrific, and I'm fascinated by all of this, but we were sort of I wanted to sort of just dial back a little bit. We were talking about the transition from these different media paradigms and how they sort of grammar reality, and how something substantively new and different in this shift to the digital. And in one of the talks that I saw today, you were talking about how kind of with television, it's about the illusory inner world. And the fact is that if a television screen has no fixed image, right? So it's like a blurry mass of images if you isolate a moment. Whereas the digital world is somehow, I think you said, about perfect memory. And I found
thanks. Let's get back on track here. It turns out that the way that digitally driven paradigm operates on us, our soul, is different from the way that the previous electric or television paradigm operated on our soul. And the mechanism involved here is not all that complicated. You can introduce any number of mimetic or imitation stories, Rene Girard, any number of approaches to this. But the ultimate result is that human beings are born without language, without technology, not able to even sustain themselves. And eventually they will come to recognize the structure of the world around them based on the technologies which are being used. And so the actual technology must be examined. Television, which we both grew up with, and so forth. And that actually doesn't mean so much television as the technology of a raster scanned screen, which has no permanent image. It's engineered specifically to fool our perceptual system. So it turns out that the human perceptual system evolved so that it could notice changes up to a certain frequency. And then as the frequency increased, our system seems to believe that it's now stable. It's not. It's flickering even faster. So around 40 hertz is, or maybe 25 hertz, it all depends, somewhere in that range, is our flicker fusion frequency. It's the way our visual perception works. So if you increase the frequency higher than that, and obviously movies were an early version of this, so you have a still frame that is held in front of the light, and then next one, sprocketed through. That is an illusion, a deliberate illusion. It's a series of still pictures in the case of a movie. In the case of a raster stand screen, there is no still picture. It's constantly refreshing across the screen. That deliberate illusion, television set is an illusion machine. That has really screwed us up. And when you dig into the details, and I can talk about this as much as you like, of the faculties of what are known as the inner senses. So this is actually quite important. Cognitive psychology, modern psychology, models human beings on computers. Computers have input and output. They have computing, they have various things that go on, but they don't have a subconscious. They have a conscious, and this is why there's so much interest in the hard problem of consciousness, and on and on and on. So you get these towards a study of consciousness, conferences, and on and on. Consciousness is only an interesting problem if you're trying to build consciousness into a robot. It is not at all an interesting topic when it comes to human beings. Human beings are driven subconsciously, which has no computing model. So the cognitive psychologists ignore that. But you and I presume much of your audience knows that what really goes on is not typically at the level of consciousness, which is important and critical, and Julian Jaynes raised that importance, but it's what goes on underneath that, the inner senses. Of the various inner senses, of which there are four, as Thomas Aquinas described it, and here the reference for those who may be following the bouncing ball, Summa Theologica, Book 1, question 78, Article 4, the title of which is, Are the Interior Senses Properly Distinguished? And it turns out that the two key internal senses that all human beings have as a result of their souls, faculties of the soul, are actually known and have been known going all the way back to ancient Greece. They've been known as imagination and memory. These are the two faculties the balance between winds up driving our subconscious and therefore much of our lives in society. We have been in a vicious loop to promote illusion. The enormous amount of promotion for creativity and an enormous amount of the way imagination winds up innocently in sentences that people are using to describe things is not their fault. It's just a reflection of the world in which we live. The structure of computers has nothing to do with imagination. In fact, computers, I was once upon a time literally a professional computer architect. All you worry about if you're architecting a computer is the memory structure. You got to get stuff into and out of the various computing units, and the overwhelming time, clock time, stopwatch time, that every computer, including the ones that we're talking on, there are hundreds of computers in this conversation right now. They're all doing the same thing. They're all freaking out about their memory. They're all freaking out that they're going to forget something. They're freaking out that there are going to be errors that are going to creep in. They're freaking out that somebody's accessing the wrong place in memory, that error correction isn't employed. The enormous importance of the accuracy of memory for computers is what humans are now patterning themselves on. So we're no longer patterning ourselves on illusion. we're increasingly patterning ourselves on memory. And this shows up in some very interesting ways. It's been going on for, take your pick, 20, 30, 50 years. But this patterning has reached the level of society in a very aggressive way in China. So whatever else you might think about China, it won't surprise you to hear from me that if you read it in the English language, it's very likely wrong. The difference between the way the Chinese understand the Chinese and the way we understand the Chinese is very fundamental. But here's the critical point on memory.
I watched a little bit of the John Altman. Was that his name?
John Alton is a Qigong master who is one of our fellows. Yeah,
it was sort of an interesting oscillation between, oh wow, this is cool, and oh no, this is even more terrifying. You know.
Well, when you start thinking about yes, energy. Energy is a word invented in Greek by Aristotle, energia, but that's not quite the same thing as what we think about energy today. But what if the Chinese have retrieved their own memory of energy, qi, typically spelled QI? And what if they have figured out how to harness qi in a way that goes way beyond the implications of quantum mechanics, which looks very childish, naive in comparison? So that was John's reaction. It turns out that the Chinese, starting 7, 8 years ago, literally the man who works with me now at Trivium University, Fred Beitler, previously Associate Dean of Liberal Studies at University of Chicago, Graham School, which is their adult education. It turns out that when the Chinese wanted to understand their own classics, they literally came to the University of Chicago and interviewed the people there who were doing great books. Then they went home, and you will now find departments of Chinese classics and departments of Western classics scattered across the entire Chinese educational system. So these are undergraduates are being taught memory of their own civilization and other civilizations. I have actually met one of the men at Peking University who was given the assignment to teach the Tao Te Ching, something which I imagine you have spent a fair amount of time with, and even more importantly, the I Ching. The I Ching is agreed by the Chinese to be at the foundation of all of this. Confucius, of course, said, if only I could live another 100 years and study the I Ching. The Standing Committee of the Politburo, that is to say, Chinese equivalent of our cabinet, has been trained in the I Ching. It turns out that among his other attributes,
this is a shift over the last few years, over the last
yes, this started in earnest about 8 years ago.
Yeah, and my until then, I mean, like you thought about like Falun Gong, for instance, which seemed like an effort to kind of regather some of the knowledge of qi, and that was just completely stamped out by the government. So it seemed they were totally against any exploration of this type of subtle energy systems.
Well, I think that may still be true, but as you know, Falun Gong was a part of a kind of 1,000 flowers period, and that was a 1,000 flowers period around the topic of qi. And you don't need to do that forever. You figure out who knows what and how things will come together, and then you clamp down on it. And so it is John Alton's view, because he was involved with this. He studied Qigong, obviously, in China, and became a master on his own, perhaps the most important in the West, where we don't have very many Qigong masters, to be fair. There's a lot of them floating around China. It turns out that he experienced personally this expansion. So he's a Westerner from southern United States. He's invited in and given all of this training, and then it all collapses. I don't want to say anything as if I know it definitively, but the notion that Falun Gong, out of that whole group, may have had some other motivations.
Well, okay, or let's say that the total mistreatment of Tibetan Buddhism, which for me is like obviously, if you're interested in esoteric technologies, that is
Right.
like the world's most significant esoteric technology, including an understanding of how to navigate in the afterlife realm.
Yeah, no, I understand, but there is no reason for either of us or anybody else to presume that the Chinese have abandoned all that. What they have suppressed is the public organizing of that against the Communist Party of China. So Falun Gong is not in their current circumstance because they did Qigong. They're in their current circumstance because they got 10,000 people to go sit at the entrance and tried to exercise the leadership. And so there's obviously a foreign intelligence component going into this sort of thing. Tibet is, as you know very well, enormously fraught as a battleground. We don't even need fascination of the Nazis with Tibet. Everybody's been fascinated with Tibet for a very long time. And so the idea that there might be something really important there, I can assure you, has not escaped the Chinese. Whether that really important stuff should therefore be publicly exposed, probably not. Whether that should be allow people to organize groups around this and enter into geopolitics, probably not.
But you're saying this could be a relatively recent shift there in any case, that they're sort of.
Well, we have good, we have good reportage that these topics were being explored very intensely as early as the 1950s.
Okay. And the other thing, obviously, is as Altman talked about, I didn't watch all of it, but that they have absolutely no, in a way, like ethical kind of, like in terms of like creating something like an artificial brain or an artificial human or something. I mean, they seem to be very much, enmeshed in this efforts, the effort around the artificial human.
Well, the artificial human is inevitable. There's no way around the artificial human. The artificial human has to happen. In many ways, has already happened.
Why do you say it has to happen?
Well, this is a very straightforward thing that Eric Schmidt once said. Don't bet against the internet. These are not technologies that can be legislated out of operation.
Yeah.
These are technologies that, in fact, need to be embraced and brought into some sort of harmony. Harmony is enormously important for the Chinese. So if your readers would like to understand China, and in particular Chinese philosophy, better, there's only one book that I can recommend. The author's name is Chad Hansen. The title of the book is A Taoist Theory of Chinese Thought, published in 1992. So it's a 30-year-old book now, but it's brilliant. And it goes through all of this, and the East-West distinctions come through very loud and clear. So judging China on Western standards would be inappropriate. Judging China on Chinese standards is fine, but there is, I think, absolutely no chance, from what I understand, and I've been studying this for a long time, that China is pursuing the same direction that, let's say, the Pentagon or Bank of America or Amazon. Remember what we have now. Amazon has just announced that they have got pick-pack robots. I know a number of people who are hiring aggressively out of Amazon. These layoffs, 250,000, 300,000 layoffs that happen in the tech industry, that is typically being portrayed as a financial measure necessary to satisfy Wall Street and so forth. Well, perhaps. But how about the fact that the technology industry are the first ones to know that you really want to replace human beings with robots? It's turned out that Ben Goertzel, if you know Ben, and many others who were sort of in the artificial general intelligence, AGI world that I follow at some distance, but got a good idea what's going on there. They have sort of given up on building artificial humans in the sense that we would think about it, but rather artificial scientists. So there's a very big push now, and Gersel is promoting this. The real reason why we need these things is for science. The real reason why we need these things is because these algorithms, robots, can discover things that humans would never discover. So there's a re-rationalization that always goes on in this, but it should not be a surprise that the people who are closest to AI are firing lots of human beings.
Yeah. I saw that in your work. You sort of go into the you define these three spheres as the East and the West and the digital.
Right.
I liked kind of you were talking about almost like an alchemical urge on the part of the sort of technorati to kind of like insatiate the lost spark or something. Was that kind of the idea?
Yeah. So my guess is that you have read more alchemy than I have. I don't know if you've ever tried to practice any of this sort of stuff, but the notion that the world is a prison, the notion that we need to somehow cultivate the divine spark, this, of course, among other things, is the basis of Scientology, which is totally constructed around that notion. This is surprisingly widespread. The notion that human beings are need to be replaced with human being version 2, which is a polite way of saying it. The notion that human beings are celestial trash, and all they can do is screw up any world in which they live, and they're impossible. They cannot be reformed, and they just constantly mess things up. This is actually quite surprisingly widespread. And so there is a whole intellectual world that stands behind and potentially justifies what the world's militaries are trying to do. And of course, it's called post-humanism. And I know many of the people in it. They're very well-meaning, very smart, and have very interesting things to say, and reject the fact that this is ultimately a academic philosophical justification for replacing humans. But they're not, in my conversations with them, they're not entirely sure why all this stuff is happening anyway. And this is the challenge that we all face. Our estimation is that there are today, active in the world, many millions of people who've given up on the preferred explanations, who have found themselves asking, what the hell is going on here? I've been lied to. Some of them fall into this conspiracy world. I don't know if that's what Russell is doing precisely, but as you know, it's very easy when given a collection of dots, data points, to start trying to draw lines between them. And start trying to somehow, this is what we do with raster scan. We do television all the time. It's a bunch of dots. There is no movie like still image there. It's a bunch of, we try to make sense of the dots. And as we try to make sense of the dots, all of which are superficial, they're on the surface. We avoid, human beings in general avoid, this is the basis of Gestalt psychology, for instance, we avoid looking at what is underneath that, the ground that stands underneath that. So conspiracy theories are just people who are trying to figure things out, but all they have are Gestalt figures. All they have are just the facts man. They don't have the structures. They don't have the grammar. And that winds up being the big challenge. There are millions of people who have already committed themselves. They've given up on the standard explanations, but they have fallen into one or another of these convenient, but ultimately always incorrect ways of understanding those dots. and they're going to have to get the dots. They're going to have to get the ground understood to make sense.
And some of those distortions are, probably products of the military-industrial complex, like the whole QAnon thing is probably to some extent a
could be. I mean,
apparently,
but it doesn't. But my main thing is it doesn't need to be. I mean, what the military needs to do is replace human beings on the battlefield.
Mm-hmm.
They don't need to brainwash us. I don't believe that. Well, who knows? There are various degrees of assignment of responsibility. My experience, which is reasonably extensive, is these people have a hard time organizing their way out of a wet paper bag. The idea that there's somebody who can secretly perform an operation at that sort of level seems highly unlikely based on my own experience with these same people.
Oh, you're talking Eric Schmitz and so on. You're talking about.
I know Eric Schmidt very well personally, and he can run a committee at the Defense Department, and he can lobby for billions, tens of billions of dollars for research. He is totally, utterly incapable of putting together something like QAnon. He's quite capable of going to Burning Man. He's quite capable of posing with a giant stuffed bear on an interview like this. I know the man. I gave the keynote speech at the very first Java 1 at his invitation. So I was, among other things, the analyst that followed Sun Microsystem. Eric was at Sun, so we go back to the 90s. And so he's a good example. He knows exactly what he's doing. He does it very well, but none of it rises to that sort of level. And so
what sort of level?
The level of a QAnon or something or other, which is deliberately designed to confuse people and send them down rabbit holes.
No, I would not think that he had anything to do with something like QAnon.
I'm just not saying he doesn't have anything to do with it. He's not capable of having anything to do with it.
I mean, it's a little bit of tangent, but apparently the best candidate for QAnon right now is Michael Flynn.
Okay.
Who's been talking a lot about this 5th generation warfare manual. Which talks about polarization and then getting people to actually kill each other is like the next generation of warfare.
Right, and so when you're dealing with somebody who has general in front of their name, you have to hold on to your wallet. you got to watch out what's going on here. I do not know General Flynn personally. I have some idea why he has risen to the prominence that he has, and so forth. But DIA, the agency that he used to run, is a good candidate for thinking some of these things through. But it's really not necessary. It turns out that without a firm understanding of the underlying principles, the psychological ground of our experiences, without that understanding, and this is where Marshall McLuhan comes in very importantly. Mm-hmm. Marshall McLuhan's borrowing a figure ground from Gestalt psychology wound up being amongst the most important things that he had to say. In Gestalt psychology, human beings, Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, is a good example of this. We tend to be distracted by bright, shiny objects. But it's not just this distraction. It's also quite deliberate. The deliberate part of this is, and here's a Marshall McLuhan quote, in a letter that he wrote in 1969 to the Catholic theologian Jacques Maritain. There is a deep-seated repugnance in the human soul against understanding the processes in which we're involved. Okay, that's kind of easy enough. The second sentence then is the real kicker. Such understanding implies our own responsibility for these processes. So human beings know they really don't have much impact on the world. A lot of people try and fail and ultimately become Buddhist or something. I was actually just on a call. Nora Bateson, you probably know Nora and the whole Bateson story. Nora has these gatherings of the Bateson crowd, and she had one the other day about runaways. Obviously, this is referring to ChatGPT. To some extent, it's referring to political hassles and how there doesn't seem to be any resolution, but in the background behind us is the runaway of the robots against the humans. And so when my turn came, I said, well, Bateson's schismogenesis and runaways and all this stuff dating back to the 30s and his anthropological work, all very useful, all very important, will need to be incorporated, but have you thought about how it relates to some other approaches? In particular, paradigm shifts. And then I said, and also the possibility that we now live not in a bipolar world, but in a truly multipolar world with three primary gravitational centers, east, west, and digital. So I think I then said something about how Cixin Liu wrote a fascinating science fiction book, Remembrance of Earth's Past, first volume of which is called Three Body Problem, Chinese science fiction writer.
I thought it was a fascinating book, yeah.
Yeah, 3 books, actually. The middle book, Dark Forest, tends to be the ones that people gravitate to the most, because that's a dark forest. Many of us think we live in a dark forest. But Cixin, by the way, this has been made into a movie. The trailer has actually been released now. If you haven't seen it, it's a fascinating trailer. So I said people thought about the possibility that it's not a binary, not a dyad, as Bateson would have described it. That you're dealing with a relationship that's dyadic. But what if it's triadic? What if it's quadratic? What if it's and nobody on the call in the public part of it had anything to say, but one of the people there said, "Oh, you need to read a 1999 essay by Donello Meadows." You remember Donello Meadows was Limits to Growth?
Yeah,
died in 2001. And she wrote an absolutely fascinating, it's dated 99, probably had been around for decades before that, called Levers of Intervention in Systems. How do you intervene in systems? So she counts down 9 different ways that I'll get the actual name for you. She counts down 9 different ways. And it turns out that the most important one is number 2. Number 2 is the highest reason that we need to consider when we're trying to find leverage points to intervene in systems. And I'm surprised that I hadn't heard of this before, but I had to ask the question and I had to get the answer in chat. It turns out that she says that systems originate in paradigms. So she is prioritizing paradigms as she understands it from Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's a very poor and limited way of understanding paradigms, but anyway. And then she says, well, we have to think about things from a different standpoint. We'll never solve anything if we think about it from the same paradigm. We got to get out of the paradigm. This is the same thing that Marshall McLuhan used to say, is that I don't know who first discovered water, but it wasn't a fish. That's probably something that a lot of people, other than Marshall McLuhan, have said. He also prided himself on being Canadian because he was outside of the United States. And so therefore, or he would say, you need a new environment to understand the past environment. These are all the same sorts of statements. She doesn't explain how paradigms happen. She doesn't explain how we might actually move into a new paradigm. And then she goes to number 1. And I thought you might enjoy this. The number 1 thing we need to do to find leverage points to intervene in systems is we need to pursue Buddhist enlightenment, because that will remove us from all paradigms. Well, while that may, in some sense, be true, Um, it also removes you from the world. So you have lost your ability to have a leverage point into systems if you just ignore paradigms. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking at this philosopher Byung-Chul Han. Have you heard about him?
I just remind me who he is.
He's a Korean philosopher who lives in Germany. He wrote a book called
Yeah,
Psychopolitics.
right. Germany, right. The
He wrote in
fellow
Germany,
writing in Germany. Yeah.
correct. But he talks about sort of the consciousness industry. I mean, a lot of people are pursuing Buddhist enlightenment. I mean, I know all these wealthy people now, and former like entrepreneurs who are now sort of making that their life, but it doesn't really seem to be helping us in this paradigm shift. But
No, it won't. And whether it will help them or not, you've known enough people who've gone through this sort of process, and I've known a fraction of those that you have known, and uh, rarely do they turn out to become holy people.
yeah.
Rarely.
Well, let's talk a little bit about. I'm kind of curious. I feel there's a lot more actually that we could dive into, and maybe we'll have another call or something in terms of teasing out, the sort of like different strands of your ideas. But I'm kind of curious about thinking kind of prospectively, like from where we are now. What do you see? What do you see as the leverage points? Like, what can we do? I mean, it does sort of feel like we are in this, in this inevitable dystopian hellscape, which is just getting more and more. The screws are getting more and more tightened,
Right.
and it's extremely unpleasant. I mean, I don't even know. Like, I mean, I've tried to form communities in the past. I try to do that again. That seems to be one of the important leverage points, but that's also so difficult because people are so kind of fragmented right now. So yeah, what the fuck do we do?
Well, herding cats is probably not a good idea. Cats. So I'm remembering the early days of Game B and Rally Point Alpha and what those folks are doing. And it's a herding cats exercise. Everybody has their own approach they want to take, and maybe they'll splinter off into a series of communes and so forth, and it will end as badly as it did last time. The answer to your question is simple. We must remember what it means to be human. That's our only task. We don't have to march in the streets. We don't have to blow anything up. We don't have to try to attract a big crowd. All we have to do is remember what it means to be human. And since Western society has so thoroughly forgotten what that is, we must go back in the West before print. We're going to have to recover a sensibility that is scribal and in many senses medieval. Now, the key, and in some sense to this, is that the Chinese have already done this. So in some sense, while we can, spin around our own merry-go-rounds, it might be helpful to look elsewhere, because we're all facing the same dilemma, which is to say artificial humans, which is to say what the hell happens with AGI? What happens with all of this? When Stephen Hawking, as you probably remember, he made this the focus of the last few years of his life. He would repeatedly get up and say, we are treating this problem. Sorry, pause. Stephen Hawking spent the last years of his life warning us about AI, which he repeatedly said is probably the worst possible thing that humanity has ever done. Didn't need to go to AGI, didn't need to go to any of this sort of stuff, didn't need to go to Ben Goertzel. Well before that, he said, we are treating this as if we have been notified by a vastly superior alien race that they are heading in our direction. So we got the message from space. And our response to this is, great. Looking forward to seeing you. we're going to bed and we'll leave the lights on for when you arrive. And the way I used to respond to this was the little green men have already arrived, and they're lime green IMAX. We have already gone through that. Stephen Hawking is not a Nostradamus. He's not a great prophet. He just could see what was going on and our reaction to it. Now, it turns out that that's happening to everybody. So it's happening in Uzbekistan. It's happening at the North Pole. But the two dominant spheres, East and West, are now contending with a third civilization, digital sphere, which seeks to replace human beings with something better. Fewer of us, but something better. And the response of the West is to bring in people who want to leave Earth and go colonize the rest of the universe, and giving them tons of money to accomplish that. The Chinese reaction to this is very, very different. The way the Chinese have treated people like Jack Ma, who was challenging on behalf of what we would call the digital sphere. The digital sphere has been, it appears, sort of comprehended. I was first invited to China in '97. That was obviously very early, but I was actually invited there as a part of a Chinese effort to get Western experts to come in and explain what this new internet technology would be and what some of its impact would be. So the Chinese have already figured out that they need to remember. They need to remember what it means to be Chinese, obviously. So therefore, Dao De Ching and Yi Jing. But we must do the same. We must remember. We must study Aristotle. We must think these things through. It's not too late by any means. There are millions of people who are have already made their minds up that they have to do something. So even a few thousand of those people who take seriously the rebalancing of our inner senses, who take seriously this discarding of this imaginary illusionary world and replacing it with a really heavy dose of memory. I'm actually quite certain that that will make an enormous difference. I'm not saying that it will totally turn things around. It won't. I'm not saying that all of the dangers which we're describing here, if everybody decided tomorrow that climate is not the worst thing that's happening, remember, we've had overpopulation, we've had a variety of things that were the crisis. So it's very common now to talk about meta-crisis. Meta-crisis tends to be just a laundry list of all the other crises. If people came to recognize that what's happened is the structure of the world has already changed, we're not forecasting something, and that new structure of the world requires us to understand it. And the only way we can understand it is by answering the question, what does it mean to be human? And the only way we can answer that question is to go back to what human beings were doing before the printing press gave us the modern world. We have to recognize that we are not modern anymore and start finding our way in the dark forest with something that is truly human. This is the reason, for instance, why Doug Rushkoff launched his project Team Human. Doug has been writing about this. He's a fellow at my center and has been very helpful with this. We need 100 more people like that who will promote humanity by remembering what it means to be human in the face of all of this politely put nonsense, less politely put manipulation.
Mm-hmm. So you don't see it as a movement that needs to be built. It's more of a kind of like a switch that people have to activate for themselves.
Well, I have a lot of things to say about movements, having been involved with some of them in the past. Um, what we're now experiencing is mobilization. So that million, 10 million, whatever the number is a mobilization, but it's unfocused. It will inevitably become a movement, but that we're not at that stage yet. We're at the herding cats stage. Everybody running off in their own directions.
Yeah.
Everybody launching their own podcasts and so forth.
It seems the technology just keeps exacerbating that. I mean, like Substack, I started a Substack and I was so happy because it actually is working well financially or whatever. But now there's like a million Substacks every day. It's like the blogosphere all over again.
Yeah. And I'm going to do one for our newsletter, and that's for a targeted audience, and so you can't expect it's going to wind up becoming a mainstream media. It's for your own audience, but what is missing.
I mean, now I find myself like scrabbling through all of these, newsletters, which are all, many of them are quite interesting, but it's like overwhelming. Like I can't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've been doing this long enough, and you're mature in your experiences, and you can find a lot of interesting things. But when you kind of look at it more closely, you'd say, well, not really. You enter the conversation this way. That's really just another version of what somebody else already said. So when I was on Wall Street, I was dubbed a contrarian. I was dubbed a variety of things. The way I described myself was as a delta detector. And so trying to find something that is truly different in this maelstrom becomes a challenge. And so I'm now in the process of starting a university, Trivia University, and starting a geopolitical newsletter, digital net assessment. And I keep being told this is just completely different from what everybody else is doing. So I don't know if there's enough delta detectors out there to recognize that you really need to step out of the usual cloud of words and start introducing words like soul and net assessment and study the trivium, which is the way education was done until modern took over. And you have to be comfortable with the recognition that we're no longer modern. We're something else. And now I'm going to have to do some serious work to study and figure out what that is.
Very interesting. Let's keep talking, but I think for today we should wrap up because that's a good hour and a half. Really enjoyed meeting you. It's fun. I think we had some Facebook altercations in the past. I was annoyed at some of your comments. I can't remember exactly what happened, but now that I see what you're up to, I'm super excited and inspired. So
great. Well, that's fine. I'm experiencing that in a number of other places. I should note for you, Daniel. People with whom I have seemed to have had controversies have then invited me in for interviews, and so I think there's a spiraling together that I sense is happening here, and I'm very glad that you've reached out, and very happy to talk to your audience.
Okay, awesome. Well, we'll stay in touch, and thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you. Bye.